everybody, and welcome to Chapter 4, Market Forces. This is the first chapter in our Unit 2, where we are going to look at supply and demand and equilibrium and policies that affect equilibrium, price, and quantity. It's going to address the first two of our unit level outcomes, understanding the difference between a movement along the supply and demand curve and a shift of the demand curve, and then understanding how equilibrium, price, and quantity change when things change in the market. So let's jump in. Here we go. We're going to start with understanding demand. This is the side of the market that has to do with consumers making demands, us, the buyers. And we make a distinction between quantity demanded, which, as you will see here, is the amount of any good that is going to be purchased because people are willing or able to purchase that good. It could also be a service. So jeans, haircuts, legal services. And then we have something called the law of demand. As you know, in economics, we like to name things with laws. And this has to do with the fact that the quantity demanded of a good or service will always fall when the price of that good or service rises. And then we make the big distinction, and we always say this, remember the caveat, other things equal, or all else being equal. So when we just look at the relationship between price of a good and service and the quantity demanded of that good or service, they're inversely related. That's our law of demand. So what that means is if we were to collect data and look at, let's say, for example, lattes. So we could look at the quantity of lattes that are demanded, and here we've collected some data in a market. We call this the demand schedule. And what it is a table that shows the relationship between price and quantity. We're going to show that this is going to obey our law of demand, where we have a high quantity when there's no price. That makes sense, right? If that would be the most that we could buy, let's say. Price, as it goes up, $1 to $2, all the way up to $5, what do you notice? The quantity demanded of these lattes goes down. So what we could do from here is take a look at one person's individual demand for, let's say, lattes. It could be mine. I love lattes. So we could take a look at my demand schedule and then graph it. This is called a curve. So what we could do is we could have the quantity of lattes on the horizontal axis, that's our x-axis, and the price on our y-axis. And then we say, how much will I demand at each price? If it's $6, you read off the demand schedule. It's coming from the curve. You can't see it, sorry, it's 4. So I would have 4 lattes that I would demand. Let's say there was a price of $1. You could read off my demand curve, which comes from the schedule, and I would have, 14 lattes. Wow, that's a lot. So it's a downward sloping demand curve to show that when price is high, I demand less, and that's the quantity demanded. When price is low, I demand more, all else being equal. So what does this tell us? If this is my individual demand curve, we could look at my neighbor's demand curve, my husband's demand curve, your demand curve. We could look at the market demand curve for lattes. And no surprise, that's also going to obey our law of demand. Here it is. It's downward sloping. So what we've done is we've added up every individual who buys lattes, and we've said, here's the quantity on the x-axis that they would demand, and here's the price that's in the market. And we base this on the data that we've collected here. So you can see that it obeys the law of demand. A high price up here, we read off of our demand curve, and it's a relatively low amount of lattes demanded. But as price comes down, what do? We're moving along this demand curve to higher quantities as related to the x-axis. That's our demand curve. And it's downward sloping because when price is high, quantity demanded is lower. But that doesn't tell the whole story. There's lots of things that go into this demand for lattes. What are they? There's consumer preferences. What are the other things that we might be choosing between to drink? So we call those shifts. And as your book describes, we call them demand curve shifters. These are things outside of what we're modeling, price and quantity, that could affect how much we want to buy or not buy of lattes. So changing consumer tastes or preferences. Anytime there's a reason why something becomes popular, maybe it's good for you, good health, maybe you buy more of it, that would shift our demand curve up and to the right. If it's bad for you, it's the opposite to the left. If there are more buyers, all of a sudden more people come to the United States and everybody's wanting lattes, more demand. Change in the price of a related good. What we need to think about, is it a substitute for lattes or is it a complement? What is a substitute? It's things I could have instead of my latte. Maybe it's tea. So all else being equal, if the price of tea goes dramatically down, since I want to maximize my satisfaction, I probably would substitute my lattes for tea, and I would drink more tea and therefore less lattes and demand less lattes. So right now I'm just describing all this in words. I'll show you some examples. And this is what you're going to practice in your assignment. What's a complement good? It's something that you have with another thing. So oftentimes people will have peanut butter and jelly together, or my daughter will have pizza and ranch dressing. So the price of one affects how much of the other you're demanding. Change in income. Sometimes we can think of things for normal goods. That means that usually as income goes up, we want more of those things. So that would shift our demand curve up and to the right. But then there's something called inferior goods. You may not be aware of these yet. What these are is actually when your income goes up, you want less of these things. So things like a bus ride maybe. You might demand less bus rides, or fewer, I should say, bus rides when you have more income because you could drive your own car, afford to have gas. And then expectations. If we expect prices to go up in the future, we would buy more now. Now, all of these shifters, they're not shown on our graph, which has price and quantity demanded, so that's why it results in a whole new demand curve. So what does that look like? Let's go. Here we have an example where we've shifted our demand curve, we've increased demand. All else being equal, there's more demand because there's more buyers. So that was my example of more people coming to the United States. We could predict if all else is equal that we were on the gray demand curve, let's say for lattes. And if all of a sudden we have more buyers, more people in our country or in our town, all else being equal, the demand curve for every price means that we will have more quantity demanded. Okay, so that's a quick and dirty down example of demand. Now we want to look a little bit at the other side of the market, supply. So there's buyers and there's sellers. There's consumers and there's producers. Suppliers are the other side. These are the people making our lattes if we stick with that example. So we can define the quantity supplied. That's any good that the seller's willing and able to sell. And then we have a law of supply. Again, we love the laws. So the laws say that no matter what, when price is high, quantity supplied will be high. Why do you think that is? Why is that the opposite of demand? Because suppliers, the producers, the people making these goods and services, they're in the business of making money. They want profits. So other things being equal, if the only thing that's going up is the price they can sell their good or service for, that means they have more of a profit margin. We're saying that the cost of making it isn't going up, just what they can sell it for. So this is rather than an inverse relationship, this is a direct relationship where when price is high, quantity supplied is going up. It's an upward sloping supply curve. Let's take a look at that. So we'll build our supply schedule using data that we've collected where we have quantity of lattes supplied with the price. And you'll notice it obeys the law of supply. As price is going up 0 to 6, the quantity supplied is going up. Okay, so we don't know anything about the cost structure of this firm, but let's say we've collected this. So this could be one supplier, and then we could look at what it looks like to graph it. So let's say it's Starbucks. Let's say it's the Starbucks down the street, and if they can get $1.70, we read off the supply curve, we see how much they would charge. Well, actually, I should say $2 because that's what's in our schedule. It's easier to see. So for $2, they'd supply 6 lattes. If price goes up to $3, what do you know? They supply 9 and up and up. We can do the same thing where we take each individual supplier, add it together, and create a market supply curve. And it'll obey the law of supply just like we did when we created a market demand curve and obeyed the law of demand. So anything other than price of the good and quantity of the good is going to create a whole new supply curve for us to model, and that's called shifting, just like we did with the demand curve. So let's take a look at what are some of the things that shift the supply curve. A change in resource prices. So that means anything that's an input to making, in this case, a latte. If that price goes up or down, that's going to affect how much the firm wants to supply. It affects their profit. A change in technology. And usually what we mean by this is some sort of technological advance. The firm is becoming more efficient, so they can produce lattes more quickly. They have a higher profit margin. They'll supply more. Change in the number of sellers. More sellers means more supply. Less sellers or fewer sellers, fewer supplied. Change in taxes and subsidies. Now, these are the policies that we're going to study in our next unit, so we can press pause on these and I'll explain these more later, but in general, anything that increases profitability is going to increase supply. Change in price of other goods, things that you could have in the production process. Maybe rather than using milk to make a latte, they decide they're going to use soy milk and that it makes it more profitable. And then a change in producer expectations. If they think they're going to get a higher price for their good later, they would want to sell less now, more later. So all these shifters, whether it's demand or supply shifters, they tell a story. And we need to then have that story change the context and show a new demand or supply curve. So it's a good idea to get really comfortable with these things that shift the different curves and know which curve it applies to so that you know how to use the model to answer the question. And you'll have practice with this. So let's take a look at an example of supply curve shifting. In this case, what I'm saying is, what if, and this is the input prices example, suppose the price of milk falls. Okay, think, how does that affect the demand side? Does it? Not really. What it is it's an input to making a latte. So if it's an input price and it's falling, all else being equal, it's cheaper to produce that good. The firm has more profit margins they can make off of selling that good. They're going to increase their supply of that good, lattes, to make more money. And we see that. For any given price, we had been on the gray supply curve. Now we're further out on the new orange supply curve that shows more supplied for any given price. Okay, we've got our demand, we've got our supply. Let's put them together to equilibrium. So here's our equilibrium. And what it means is that we take our downward sloping demand curve, we take our upward sloping supply curve, and we let them intersect and set an equilibrium price that makes quantity supplied and quantity demanded exactly equal. And in this case, it's a price of $3. That's our equilibrium price in the market, and a quantity demanded equaling quantity supplied, or a quantity in the market of 15 lattes. Pretty remarkable. Nobody said what the price needed to be of lattes. Nobody said how much to supply. We let the interaction of consumers and producers come up with what the price would be. And so that's what Adam Smith talks about when he talks about the invisible hand guiding the market, is that we let the market decide what will be the best allocation of resources so that people who value and want to buy the good can at the price they're willing to, and the suppliers can make enough money to cover their costs at that price. Later, we'll talk about when supply doesn't equal demand and what that means. So if this is, let's go through an example of hybrid cars. Let's say this is an equilibrium where we're not going to specify price, we can just call it P1 and Q1, an equilibrium price and quantity for hybrid cars set by supply and demand. And then what if I were to tell you that, oh my goodness, there's a shift because there was an increase in price of gas. Step one, you need to think about which curve shifts. And in this case, because it's the price of gas affecting the demand for hybrids, it means that fewer people want to buy that substitute good, the cars that use gas, and so they actually choose to buy more of the hybrids. So all else being equal, step two shows we've shifted the curve to the right. Higher gas prices make hybrids more attractive. That's a change in a price of a substitute good. And so what does this shift do? It causes an increase in the price. Look, you move from having this equilibrium at P1 and Q1 to having this equilibrium at a higher price, P2, and a higher quantity. That is what we try to use this model for, is to say what's going on in the real world and take it to our equilibrium marketplace and see how price changes and quantity changes. So now we could predict if there's an increase in price of gas, we would expect the price of hybrid cars to go up. That's how we use this model. So I just want to take a few minutes, or a few seconds I should say, to say we have to be really careful about a movement along versus a shift. Anytime we do a change in a supply, that's a shift, just like a change in demand, shifting the supply curve. It's when something that's not a price that affects supply, like those shifters, is in play. Same with demand. It's a shift in the demand curve. Something other than price of the good, like income or number of buyers, has an effect. We could have a change in the quantity supplied, and that's when we move along the curve. And that's just going to a different point along our supply curve or our demand curve. Okay, So that's what I wanted to say about supply and demand. Thanks for listening. And what comes next is how we apply this with policies. I look forward to talking to you then. Thanks.